to say we have done a ton of coastal resilience planning and policy development over the years since 2018, our first sea level rise vulnerability assessment. Obviously, I'll share these slides with you so you can take a look at this stuff, but the blue work is the work that we've completed, policy study plans. The kind of grayish is work that we're working on right now, with the ones outlined in red are ones that we're really actively working on right now. And then the green are things that are coming in the near future for us. So, one thing here is I think the takeaway here is that the planning is never ending. It's not a one and done. And we have to be continually revising, iterating, and bringing in new information and science. So just to kind of set the stage for why adaptation pathways, in California, we have what's called the Local Coastal Program, which is a policy document that all coastal jurisdictions should have. They should be certified by the California Coastal Commission, which has the holds jurisdiction as a regulatory entity along our coastal zone. And our coastal zone goes anywhere from a few blocks to a few miles inland. And so the local coastal program really defines the policies on how development happens on our coastline. And so our existing local coastal program dates back to the early 90s, and it already included a number of policies related to monitoring and using triggers, which adaptation pathways, of course, relies on to signal when the next adaptation strategy should be implemented. And then on the right-hand side, we just adopted, after 5 years of development, a new Beaches and Bluffs chapter on adaptation pathways, which really spells out the adaptation pathways piece a little further. You can see here key features to establish triggers and thresholds. For example, if X number of feet of bluff erosion occurs, action Y should take place. And I'm going to show you some specifics on this. So we continue to codify the use of adaptation pathways in our work. And it's really important that that is aligned with some of our other plan documents. So we adopted in March of this year our 5-year local hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. This is actually the first combined hazard mitigation and adaptation plan approved by FEMA in the United States. And it calls specifically for developing out our adaptation pathways and our coastal change monitoring network, as well as our 50-year community vision for West Cliff Drive. So these policy documents, these plans are all reinforcing the use of adaptation pathways as the smart approach to being proactive on coastal management, which incidentally, the state of California wants us to be doing, right? There's not a policy requirement for that, but well, actually there is. There's a new Senate bill, SB 272, that requires a minimum threshold or minimum criteria for adaptation planning in coastal jurisdictions, and adaptation pathways is one of the criteria that has to be met. So it actually now is codified. So in terms of, and I'm going to again get into some specifics, is really general here, but we have a draft set of physical and social triggers or conditions to monitor. Most of our triggers are physical observations, but we do have this sense of preparedness that through a lot of engagement we've determined is something that we need to be monitoring. And we haven't determined yet what happens next, but we have been focusing quite a bit on household resilience building to increase this sense of preparedness, which we ascertain through every 5 years, our LHMP survey that we do with the community. But you can see that, the rest of these triggers really are related to physical damage or physical, parameters, depth of sea level rise, loss of public use and access, and so forth. And why we say draft physical triggers is that we have not yet codified or had adopted this working set of triggers that we've been developing, and then the consequent uh, actions that will happen, but that is coming very soon. So I'll share more on that in a moment. So just to orient you, the city of Santa Cruz is on the central coast of California. We're about 70 miles south of San Francisco on the Monterey Bay in a marine sanctuary, which presents its own challenges. We are often called the Serengeti of the oceans, with the biodiversity and marine wildlife. But as you can see here, this is projections on sea level rise, impacts in the city. One thing it doesn't include is the contribution of riverine flooding. We have since actually done a study to combine those. I need to actually replace this slide because, you know, when we have coincidental sea level rise with a storm event that's exacerbated by climate change, we will obviously have a greater inundation. This particular map is sea level rise, but we also have similar maps for erosion and coastal storm flooding, as well as that riverine contribution. As you can see, our low-lying areas behind Main Beach, you know, there's connectivity to the coast through storm drains. So we will have some flooding there in the low-lying areas. The lighter the color is the further out into the century, although we are trying to get away from those time horizons, right? The whole point of adaptation pathways is to overcome the uncertainty and when these things will actually happen and not plan prematurely or too late, but rather use these physical triggers. Along West Cliff Drive, we have bluffs, 20 to 40-foot bluffs here. So not so much on flooding, except there are a few pocket beaches. But these two areas, Main Beach and West Cliff Drive, are two areas that I'm going to really focus in on how we've developed adaptation pathways. We have about just about 4.5 miles of coastline, by the way. Okay, so West Cliff Drive, I'm sorry, this is a little fuzzy, but we do have 4 zones on West Cliff Drive, and I'm really going to focus in on zone 2 there. And in January of 2023, we had some serious damages take place. And why I'm starting with this is because I'm going to show you how we blew through all of our short, medium, and long-term triggers and thresholds that we had developed for West Cliff Drive. So we had this significant damage because that storm was a once in every 40-year event. It was followed in December of the same year by a once every 15-year event that caused some further damage. And of course, with sea level rise and climate change, these events are going to become more common and more intense. And in fact, where these damages happened, these were areas we already knew were vulnerable from our sea level rise vulnerability assessment. And in fact, these were areas that were in design already for riprap repairs, which unfortunately did not happen in time for this damage to happen. So really, you know, in the past, we've been thinking about short, medium, long term in this kind of way, these years. But really, the future is now, and the use of this triggers and thresholds approach really has been embraced even further because of this storm damage. So in zone 2, in the near term, we had a trigger related to armoring integrity. And if the revetment showed signs of failure, we needed to repair the riprap or put in a seawall. And in fact, we were doing that, as I mentioned. In the medium term, we had a trigger around cliff erosion, whereas if the distance between the cliff top edge or the bluff top edge and the recreation trail, there is a recreation trail on the seaward side of West Cliff Drive, which is a 2-lane corridor. If it's less than 5 feet, build a seawall. That was exceeded in the January storm. Another medium-term trigger and threshold was loss of public use or access. If the rec trail and or beach access was repaired more than twice per year over a 5-year period, that was exceeded in January 2023. And lastly, a long-term trigger and threshold we had identified was related to costs. If infrastructure was repaired more than twice over a 5-year period and the repair costs from the impacts exceeded $500,000, again, exceeded in January 2023, which told us we should retreat from the coastline. What we did do though was build, oh, and just again, a reminder, this isn't yet codified, it's in progress. So here's what happened. We built those seawalls. We had to build back with the same kind of strategy that was already there in order to access FEMA and FHWA Federal Highway Administration funding, which meant armoring, even though Coastal Commission, our preference is not to do armoring because it takes up space on the beach. It causes more erosion around adjacent areas that don't have armoring, but we were really constrained and we had to get this done very quickly so that another storm didn't happen that tore through even further through the road. Fortunately, we only have one home on the seaward side of West Cliff Drive, so we do have the road to blow through. But I will tell you, in that storm, it lifted some of this riprap rock over into this White House's front yard right here where this truck is. So, it was very close to damaging homes. So here's two of the info walls. Here's the third, and then new riprap in front of it. And this is what it looked like under construction. And this construction happened within a year. And this was fully reopened this summer. We did have to close a couple lanes of traffic. As a result of the December 2023 storm, we had this bite taken out right here. You can kind of see where my cursor is. That was also some failing riprap in that area. We have not yet repaired that area. But because of these seawalls that we've put in, the California Coastal Commission requires mitigation, meaning where are you going to either move back, put in access improvements, put in habitat improvements that'll mitigate the harm that's anticipated from those seawalls. Part of our mitigation package is this micro realignment or this mini managed retreat. So this is actually not going to happen summer of next year. The latest is that it should be complete by summer of 2028. So this is in design right now. It takes it back from what's estimated to be 100-year erosion, and we will not then be putting any riprap or anything in place here. We might do some kind of step down pools to handle, or step pools rather, to handle stormwater runoff in this area, which also exacerbates erosion, but we will not be re-armoring this. We also recently completed a nature-based solutions feasibility study, and this is kind of a working set of adaptation pathways that our consultants provided to us. It's not really in the format that we've been using, but you can see here they propose some additional adaptation triggers and thresholds that we had not been considering previously. Things like loss of dry beach for more than 6 months or more than a year. Also bringing in something related to state guidance on artificial reefs. Right now, the state of California is developing rules around how to permit artificial reefs. Currently, it's very difficult to do an artificial reef if the primary purpose is not for restoration. If it's for shoreline protection as the primary purpose, it's not allowable in most cases. So we have done, and I'll show you, we've looked at a potential artificial reef concept. But suffice it to say, there are a lot of options on the table for triggers and thresholds. And one thing that, sometimes it's really, these have been developed. I'm going to show you kind of a decision tree that we used for Main Beach and for some other areas. But a lot of times this is really developed through professional judgment on what is an acceptable risk for the community, and testing that out through some engagement, testing it out through leadership and city staff, and then refining it. However, our Coastal Commission, when we started to put this together in a document and they reviewed it, they did ask, what is the basis for this? And in some cases we had it like, well, okay, we're projecting erosion to happen through this model. But in other cases, it was really just like, this is a starting point and we don't necessarily have a technical basis. So that was something that as we started to develop next step triggers and thresholds, we kept in mind is, Coastal Commission wants to know what is the basis for this. So really kind of kept that in mind as we thought about things. And then here's some of those other Westcliff nature-based solutions recommendations. I talked about over in this area where the micro realignment in green, doing some step pools, some native plants. But really because we have such a high energy coastline and not a lot of space, there's not a lot of opportunity for pure green nature-based solutions. So most of our recommendations that we're pursuing funding for are gray green. For example, integrating tide pool armoring blocks at the base of our revetment, integrating infiltration basins and step pools at the top of bluffs where we know runoff is a problem. And then of course, native plants all over. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, Lighthouse Field, which is owned by state parks, is a source right at that area where we're doing that micro realignment of runoff. And so we've talked to them about potentially doing some temporary ponds that would be seasonal ponds that could capture runoff, sink it, slow it, sink it. But that's kind of a continuing conversation. Let's move over to Main Beach then. So Main Beach, if you remember, it's actually the most visited beach in our region. With 3 feet of sea level rise, we're expecting 100 feet of beach loss already in this area. You'll also see that our river mouth on the right-hand side often meanders across the beach and creates quite a safety issue. We've actually had during breaches, this is like a sandbar that forms across the river mouth. And when that's been breached, we've actually had 2 deaths over the last 20 years because it will sweep folks out and it's very difficult to swim in. So this is an area in particular that I'm going to show you some work on. So again, bringing in the sea level rise projections here, the black and white lines are actually the foundation of the boardwalk, which is a amusement park that's right on the beach. And in fact, they own about half the beach, which is really unusual for California, where most beaches are public, are owned by the state or jurisdictions. And then there is a small curb wall along Beach Street, it's just about 3 foot high. So not really true seawalls, but they do act as seawalls in that the beach cannot erode back. All the red areas are access points, so many access points. And our projections are that the beach could be reduced up to 50% by 2060 and be fully inundated during high tides by the end of the century. And so, what are we going to do about that? And so we've thought through a series of pathway strategies for the near, medium, and longer term. You can see 1A shows a living shoreline. 1B is increasing pump capacity. We do have pumps back in this area to pump out this area that already gets some nuisance flooding from the river on occasion. Not too serious though. In the medium term, we could raise this curb wall. In the longer term, we could elevate buildings and move back. So what are the triggers and thresholds for that? So we have one that if beach width during winter king tides is 100 feet or less for 3 years in a row, or if wave overtopping for 3 days a year that causes storefront damage or flood damage in the beach flats, that we would go to the medium term adaptation strategy. And you can see this is the original visualization that we developed initially and this doesn't even have the thresholds in here to kind of visually depict this near, medium, and long-term strategy. And so, and this shows, I do think this is kind of useful. And we have this for all 4 zones on Westcliff Drive. And then our 3 beaches that we evaluated with the adaptation pathways approach. This is kind of how we thought through with our staff. How do we even think about triggers and thresholds? And I thought that this was a really useful tool that we utilized where there were triggers and decision points that had to be thought through along with the potential options. So I'm not going to run through this, but I think it's something that could be useful for folks that are developing it out on their own. And then on Main Beach, we are actually, we're fully funded to design and build a pilot living shoreline concept, a vegetated dune concept that you can see here with 4 different treatments. This whole area pre-development was all vegetated dunes. And so when eventually we have to move back, this will give us some information about how we could reestablish dunes for coastal protection. It will help to prevent that meandering of the river. Working in concert with a vertical berm, we were able to push the sand around. The berm is about perpendicular to the coastline. That also helps that meandering. And in fact, really interestingly, we had buried some woody debris from one of those 2023 storms over kind of where this combination of cobble and woody debris is supposed to go. And guess what? That buried woody debris, there just this year, there started forming a vegetated dune. So we already have a natural vegetated dune forming, but I am spending about $2 million to put in this pilot one. So hopefully, we'll get some good information out of this. To understand, how this could help prevent storm surge. Also, I should mention we have a really great tribal partnership here with a couple different tribes who consider this river mouth to be a very sacred space, and they're extremely supportive of nature-based solutions in these vegetated dunes. And we're talking to them about potential harvesting opportunities for them and they're assisting us in selecting the vegetation. We also looked at, splitting Main Beach, or between Main Beach and over where West Cliff Drive is our wharf. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, we had a really gnarly storm in January of this year that actually, you might have seen it, made national news. The last 150 feet of our wharf, which is the longest wood frame wharf in the United States on the coastline, we lost 150 feet of it that just came off like a huge surfboard and floated away with our restrooms on that wharf. We knew that this endpoint was vulnerable. We actually were in the process of putting in place resiliency measures, which always seems to be the case with us. We're like right in the middle of doing something and then something happens. And so you can see at the bottom what that looks like now. We did look at the feasibility of an artificial reef off the wharf and found that the modeling showed that an artificial reef under different configurations below the water surface could mitigate wave energy or dissipate wave energy between 50 and 90%. Now, this is just a first pass technical feasibility. This whole area is a world-class surf zone. Here, Steamer Lane surf break with other surf breaks going to Cow Beach here. There's navigation issues, there's fishery issues, there's all kinds of other things we need to look at. And again, that rulemaking is happening on artificial reefs. So we'll continue, to take a look at this as that all evolves. So how are we going to bring this all together and actually, quote unquote, codify it? We are working on medium-term shoreline adaptation and management plans right now for these 3 areas: West Cliff, the main Cow Beaches, and East Cliff and Seabright Beach. And we will be codifying the adaptation pathways approach through the final deliverables that will happen at the end of 2026 for this planning process. And that's called for in our local coastal programs, Beaches and Bluffs chapter that was just adopted by the city. Of course, you cannot operationalize adaptation pathways without coastal monitoring. And so we do have a working kind of concept or design rather, for coastal monitoring that involves different camera sites in red, perhaps community science stations where people can set up their phones on these little cradles and take pictures and upload them. We installed a tidal gauge at our wharf, and we fly drone imagery along the same path every year post-winter. We are talking to Surfline. So since we designed this monitoring network about over the last 4 years, basically, Surfline's come out with a new analytical platform to complement their cameras that they deploy to watch surf breaks, and we already have a number of those in the city. So we're trying to see if do we need to do this bespoke kind of custom thing that I'm going to show you, or can we use some off the shelf options? Another element to this is that I'm really trying to get our public works department to think about the coastal assets just like any other infrastructure. And we're trying to bring that in to our coastal, or our infrastructure asset management tool, where work orders are generated, where we keep the condition of infrastructure assets in place. You can see that in the upper left-hand corner. And we are planning to do a module with CityWorks, as this is the first coastal module that they'll do, bringing in stairwells, the revetment, the seawalls, the beaches themselves as infrastructure, so that we can manage them in the way we do all of our other infrastructure across the city. And this coastal change monitoring network would have a dashboard, both a kind of a public facing dashboard that summarizes where we at on all of these triggers. Would be tracking these triggers. A lot of it would be automated and generating alerts as to when we approach these thresholds. That's searchable by location, time frame, season. I want to look at Main Beach shoreline change for this season over the last 5 years, right? So this becomes a decision support tool for the city. This might be internally, you can see that shoreline change on the right-hand side for this. I can't remember where this is. I think this is someplace in Australia, who has kind of something similar to what we're trying to do. So again, trying to give us more tools for decision support to really fully realize this adaptation pathways approach. And of course, the communication piece is so important. We've really experimented with virtual reality, our Cards Against Catastrophe game that really gives a flavor for kind of trade-offs in decision making and limited resources. We have Spanish language loteria, which is like a Mexican bingo that we play with kids, that's tailored for Santa Cruz. Again, just all ways that we can reach people. Even we've done experimentation with dance, and you can see on the right hand side that CoSnap pilot that we have that allows community science for folks. So the last piece is, how do we fund all of this? And right now, we are part of Resilient Cities Catalyst's California Coastal Accelerator, where we're going to be doing a coastal infrastructure funding and financing feasibility study. Perhaps we need to do a local measure, because I will tell you, grants alone are not going to fund all of this. And we need a sustainable funding source for all of this work. So some of the things we're exploring: climate resilience districts are enabled here in California through legislation, geologic hazard abatement districts, perhaps parametric insurance, biodiversity credits, although initially I think the scale isn't appropriate for biodiversity credits. So this is a big area we need to focus in on over this next year. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this work is really iterative. It requires a lot of collaboration. This is just a few of our collaborators. I do want to point out in the lower left-hand corner, the Peers Network. And I put the link here because Peers is an international organization that is solely focused on coastal adaptation pathways. So you might want to go and take a look at some of the resources that they have there. New Zealand, some places in Europe, that how they've operationalized adaptation pathways, because everyone does do it a little different. Our way is one way, but folks have done it in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of great resources on this Peers website, so I encourage you to check it out. And some other resources. We have a new nature-based solutions virtual reality app that you can do on your computer. Check that out. It's guided by Otter841, who's been terrorizing surfers in our area for the past couple of years, but we've put him in a little less malevolent light and a more helpful light. And then for more information on anything I've talked about here today, you can go to our Resilient Coast Santa Cruz webpage and find, different plans, policy documents, and so forth. So with that, I hope I didn't talk too much. I'm sorry that there was a lot there, I know, but please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to have any discussion with folks right now on adaptation pathways. So thank you, and let me stop sharing my screen.